Welcome to Billion Dollar Moves, the show for the top US and Asia founders, funders, and execs. From the growing pains of a unicorn journey to IPO, scaling a venture capital firm, and the shift of wealth, we cover it all. Good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be back here.
Responsible and impact-oriented investing, having led impact initiatives for two privately held family offices, including being managing director of Rockefeller Capital Management. She's also the chair of the Meyer Foundation and founder of the Pomona Society, a collective of women in impact who come together to effect systemic change for women and families in the District of Columbia. In full disclosure, she's also one of my newest best friends, helping me out here on a soft launch where we will hopefully be having a smooth show, but we'll be forgiving enough if we do have some glitches. So please bear with us, folks. And just as a reminder, if you're tuning in on Clubhouse, we will be opening up for question and answers later in what we call the after party, where we will be diving deeper after the 30-minute mark with Karen. So Karen, thanks so much for joining us. How are you today?
I'm doing great. And Sarah, thank you so much for having me. It's exciting to have this conversation and see so many listeners interested in it. So thank you for doing this.
No, of course, it is my pleasure. And, when I was thinking about who the first perfect guest would be to really set the tone for what Billion Dollar Moves is all about, I thought about you because not only have you done a lot of billion dollar moves in your own life, but also in impacting so many lives, and that's really what it's about. So let's start with the first part here. We want to dive deep and really dive into also your personal journey. And from the outset, not many would have guessed that you personally have a deep personal connection to your mission and has impacted the way that you're thinking about the work you do. So tell us a little bit about what got you here and, even your moment in poverty, if you don't mind.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Because I think like everyone probably listening, we arrive at our work and our vocation a lot of through lived experience, right? And so my story really started as a child, losing my parents early in life and kind of setting in motion a very deeply impoverished childhood. And what that informs you when you're going through something like that is you see better than most where the systems are broken, right? And so throughout my life, whether it's the education system that we're dealing with today and public education, when I say that, or whether it's the healthcare system, whether it's food insecurity, whether it's workforce, and how do you engage in mainstream economy when you are growing up in such a way that you can't access anybody to help you do that, right? And so for me, I was really fortunate that I loved mathematics. And so I went down a journey educationally in finance that kind of launched me to where I am today, and had the really good fortune, because of the way I grew up, very independent, very much a caretaker of my family. I kind of stepped in as a child parent of my siblings. And in doing so, you become so resourceful. Not only are you trying to solve your own needs in Maslow's hierarchy, but you're also really, really concerned about these siblings that are around you that you feel personally responsible for, as though they're your own, right? And so, and then one of the things that I think is lost on our society and how we think about solutions for the poor is we aren't living in those experiences, and so we're not proximate. And I kind of call this proximity for change, right? And so if people who are living in poverty tend to become very alienated from how the rest of the economy is really working, right? And as time goes on, the longer you're living in such a state, the harder it becomes to re-engage with a community. And so just through my own lived experience, I became deeply passionate about giving back as I kind of launched a career and finished formal education. I have always been, I would say, in parallel to my professional career, growing this community activist work, philanthropy work that was really centered around children in poverty and women that are oftentimes the only caretakers of those children. But I would say, in fairness, it really starts with my love of trying to fix the youngest humans among us and help them so
Right.
that we have a different future state. And that's really where I became so passionate about how I could weave in my profession into community work. And I'm a little bit different than others in the finance profession in that I very much have gray areas between, how I think about capital and where I'm allocating it, and whether that's capital in time, capital in, real money, the way that we think about it, and what's the highest and best use for, our society's capital and my personal capital. And I kind of developed, advisory techniques that help other stakeholders make decisions around some of those same themes. So it's been a really rewarding journey. I'm a long way from done. And every year we have interesting things that present that are can be catastrophic to broader society. And then how can I kind of lend expertise and propel some of these ideas forward? But that's how I came to today and the work that I do.
Right, love it, and truly a testament for how resourceful, right? I mean, part of my professional work is really about fueling women's led innovation through venture capital and the funds that invest in them, because we really do see this. We see how resourceful, especially in this time of a pandemic, right? In COVID-19, where women have been so disproportionately hit, 31%, decline in venture capital funding in the first 3 quarters last year. But just looking at your story, I've seen so many personal stories like this where women are just so resourceful, and part of this sort of success story of why they also outperform, because the good news, bad news is they're underfunded, but because they've thought about cash management, they've thought about their resources around them, they're able to push that a lot further in terms of runway and in terms of what's next. And I'm glad to see that story in you as well. And from being in poverty to then leading Rockefeller Capital Management, and then doing what you are now with some of the wealthiest families, endowments, and foundations. I mean, that speaks very, very, favorably for what you've done. So congratulations on that, Karen. And so thrilled to have you on as the first guest. Now let's turn to today's topic, the end of impact washing, or is it? And I'm sure, many, especially on the Clubhouse stage and in the room, are probably, given where we are in Invest Club, that's so kindly set up by Jacques Philippe here. So thanks, Jacques Philippe, for this opportunity for us to really share this moment with your crowd as well. But for many of us who are tuning in as well, we might not be practitioners like you. So let's set the stage for the topic here. What does impact mean, and why are we talking about impact washing? Is this really the case that we're seeing it being used and misappropriated as a term? What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, no, I love kind of the theme of our talk because it's really front and center in what I call there's a good bit of sensationalism right now, right? And so we've never before. And first, I do want to call out that we are having this show in the month of Women's History Month. And there is so much wrapped in this month around women and equal pay. And we're 50 years from that decision and that legislation, but yet 39 years out from actually achieving it. So that's an almost 90-year gap, right? So kind of tuck that away. But one of the things that I think last year unveiled more than any other time in history is this perfect storm of kind of women's inequity, racial inequity, corporate behavior. Who are the good actors in corporations that can help solve community problems? And then really deep political fractures, right, that divided people. And so we kind of came, and then we saw kind of the healthcare inequity kind of exposed, front and center. And so all of those were such sensational topics all of last year and still now. And the term washing really come, and it kind of comes from the the origins of it are around greenwashing. So if we think about environmental investments, investments that are to think about climate action, or think about renewables, or think about global, the environment broadly, there's always been suspicion around, okay, is someone who's overseeing that investment or that idea really just is it really just the veneer? If you unpacked what they're actually doing, what a company's actually doing, are they actually moving the needle? Are they actually measuring the change, the impact that they're having? And even if they're trying to not do more harm, right? That's a measure. Like, look, I'm going to stem the bleeding, right? And that's also a measure. So where we're at in this moment in time around washing and impact washing, take all of those themes and the word, and if we kind of think about and unpack what impact means, it's really, let's take education, for example, because that's kind of near and dear to me. Is we have right now a public school crisis in America, and I'll kind of call it America since we have global listeners here, but we've had children out of school for more than a year, and for every trimester a learner is not learning equals about 3% of future wages lost, right? Wow. So if you think about, and that's significant, that's about 1.3 trillion in future GDP not earned. And so if you think about, okay, what can I do today to change that story, that future story, and what kind of investment does that look like? And the impact you're having is closing that metric, right? So we want to close the metric that is this future GDP lost, or this future learner unable to succeed in workforce and earn a livable wage or better than, right? And so that to me is a clean example, because it really speaks to the human element of impact, a little bit different than, say, environmental impact. And what we're trying to do in the environment is reduce pollutions, toxins, carbon footprint. And we have a set of goals that the world has come together around to decide what are these I call impact themes. And there are 17 of them, so that we can all arrive at a similar outcome. And so these are set forth by the United Nations. They're called the Sustainable Development Goals. One of them is to eliminate global poverty, right? It's something very near and dear. It's also, another is to create equality in education. And so these are all, every country comes to these goals with different degrees of severity in trying to achieve them. And so you and I, as investors and capital allocators, have an opportunity to say, okay, what can I do then to contribute to this deadline, this looming deadline of the year 2030, where we should have parity on some of these inequalities. And so that, when we're talking about impact, that's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to have this really big impact, that we arrive at a place where there is greater economic participation, where there's a better, more higher quality healthcare distribution. We're seeing kind of America's broken healthcare system today in just how we're distributing a vaccine, something a little bit straightforward, but somehow we aren't really managing that in a way that is very scalable. So there's impact to be had there. And then who are the people that were really suffering through the pandemic, because we came into the pandemic with such unequal footing, right? In a variety of our communities across the country, but largely disproportionately, and I think you hit on it, disproportionately affecting women. And listeners may not realize, but in the December unemployment numbers, the net jobs lost were 100% owned by women.
Right.
And so that's a setback to 1980 women entering the workforce, right? And the numbers of getting more and more women into the workforce. And so we took a few steps back. And so the impact we need to have is squarely our charge in who we fund. What does that look like? And how we can actually bring more capital to the table to support what those unemployment numbers largely then it's usually about 50%, believe it or not, that ultimately go to a place of, look, I'm going to start my own business. I'm not going to re-enter the workforce in the way that I was before, and I'm going to start my own business. And we're going to see a lot of that springing to life here in the next year or two. So
Yeah. Thanks for that, Karen. And I think it's interesting that you touch on a few points, but one thing I did want to pick up, and you spoke about this, I believe on Mission Forward as well, in terms of where we are, which I thought was quite a sticking point there that left me really rethinking a lot of the work that we're doing, right? And even in the venture capital space, where you talked about on that podcast a little bit about the war on poverty and the fact that, when this was a concept that was brought to life in the US, I believe it was in 1964, 19% was the number, right, of Americans living in poverty. And now, more than 50 years later, 2 million nonprofits later, where the sole purpose is tied to breaking the cycle of poverty, the gap has actually widened. And it points to the fact that, we are, doing no harm is not good enough.
Right.
And, especially now, and it will be remiss for me not to even mention the moment that we're in with the rise of hatred against Asian Americans and just the rise of racial reckoning, that the perfect storm of everything right now. And investors are sort of sitting there, doing sometimes I think, it looks like more of the same. And my question is to you with this as a backdrop, right, of poverty being one of the goals that you work on. And of course, there are many other goals that we're talking about here, the 17 SDGs. Where has investing and impact investing gone wrong here? And where are we going?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I talked on that podcast, I call kind of a triple threat, right? You and I talked about this, and it's really, if we think about what we all need to kind of succeed, live healthy, productive lives, it centers around education, workforce, and healthcare, right? And we're at a moment in time where we're deciding what of those things are necessities and should be borne by all, and what of those things are personal choices borne by you, right? And where we have inequities, and especially in the education space, and then also in workforce, is really around, and this is where I think impact investing has gone wrong. And this is where impact washing is kind of coming in, is we have about 500 billion right now that is been allocated to what I would call impact investment funds. Those look to be private offerings, right? So when I say that, I want to separate from the kind of public markets and the theme around environmental, social, and governance, and what we call in the practice ESG. And so we'll separate those out for a minute. And where the great influence, where impact investment hasn't gotten the traction that it should have, or should have by now, is largely who are the stakeholders at the table. Right. So a lot of those funds originate with what looks like the same legacy private equity and or hedge or venture capital funds. I would challenge anyone, and I think there's plenty of statistics. That's about a 9. Like if you took an average ownership group of an impact fund, you might see 8 men, 2 women, right, that are part of that. And then the odds look even worse if you're a person of color having a stake in an impact fund. So there isn't this relatable body governing that capital. There's big, great ideas, but there isn't the relatable person at the table that can lend the voice of what's happening in the community. What are you trying to solve? And do you have the person who's had that lived experience in the room helping to challenge why something may or may not work? And so you end up having, some that survive, and we're getting and then some shut down and close and don't get the traction. Some of the issue too, and so if you just take lack of diversity, no different than in the corporate world, and especially in my space in finance, lacks huge diversity in the upper ranks, right? And that's not lost on anybody here, I would suspect, listening to the call. But if you take lack of diversity and you take the past 20 years where in some of the impact funds, you don't have, I would say, policy supports. So in investment land, a lot of times up until I would say the recent 5 years, you really had silos of who was going to oversee the capital and how that got influenced. And so, an impact investment entrepreneur wouldn't so much be out talking about, okay, what are the policy supports and what are those levers? And I can't actually succeed or scale without certain policy supports, and whether those are federal supports or local municipal supports. And I don't mean tax subsidies in this way. What I mean really is legislation and governing bodies not getting in the way of improving something that we believe is a complete violation of how we should be living as people, or how the planet should be continuing to breathe, right? And right now we have this wonderful moment in time where we actually have a more supportive administration. And as you saw quickly, we rejoined the Paris Treaty Agreement. We have also started to kind of bring back into legislation or opinions about who can and can't invest in environmental social governance themes as institutional buyers. So that's what I mean. There has to be an acknowledgement that there really is a partnership between private enterprise and public policy. And I think after last year, I think that kimono is wide open, right? That, okay, there is a role to play. The stakeholder umbrella is much larger than just the shareholder who made the initial investment, seeking just one, simple return, right? We actually are now seeing stakeholders throughout the employee ranks, throughout who we even partner with in other vendors as a public corporation. So all of those voices now are coming to the table and saying, okay, now we need to be a little bit more transparent. And that's back to the washing comment. And a lot of the regulations that are coming out right now, or opinions, I should say, from the SEC, and then also kind of bolstering what SASB, which is the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, have laid forth as to, okay, there has to be metrics that we're going to be held accountable to, and there have to be transparency to investors that are buying into these kinds of ideas and themes, and that's going to improve all of the capital inflows, I think.
Absolutely. And Karen, I just want to, dig a little deeper here as well, and sort of layer it on in the context of endowments. You talk what you're talking about here is in terms of the roles of the different parties, right? So not just I think the more the Warren Buffett type approach, which is it's you're in it for the shareholder. But now what we're seeing, and I'm also a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, one of the popular things that are coming up is stakeholder activism, and the fact that you must do more and you must reflect. Right. I think at the end of the day, part of my work is also speaking with pension funds, and a lot of them are really thinking hard about, wait a minute, our money managers don't reflect the beneficiaries that we are in business for, right, to support. David Swensen, right, Dean Swensen, who's part of Yale $32 billion endowment, who goes on to influence, I want to say, in his group, more than 100 billion combined. So those who followed suit in his type of model, which again has pros and cons, and there's a lot of debate around that. But the fact that even at that level, they're demanding a lot more. Are you seeing this at your level with your work in endowments and foundations as well, in terms of, where does the investment go, and what does this mean with regards to the practicality of stakeholder activism here?
Oh, absolutely. And if you think about, especially in private foundations, another kind of tax exempt silo, much like the endowments, and you have this requirement set forth by the IRS that 5% has to go out by way of grants to achieve your mission, right? Whatever it is. And if I take the foundation that I oversee and am investment chair for, that's a very clear mandate as to where that 5% goes, and who you're going to influence in the community, how you're going to meet the objectives. And in the work I do with that foundation, it's around racial equity, largely, right? And then what happens to this other 95%? That there's a much bigger pool of capital, much bigger lever to pull to actually have a voice in system change. And that has, up until more recently been siloed as two separate objectives, two separate agendas, right? And now what you're seeing is, wait a second, I'm actually invested in things that are antithetical to what I'm distributing out the front door by way of grants. So
Right.
I'm a practitioner who really firmly believes in looking at the entirety of it holistically and saying, okay, can you actually have some influence on the investment piece that you can create mission aligned investment programs? And that's very much happening. And where, and you just have to think about, okay, who's the governing body that you're reporting up to in private foundation land, a little bit different than endowment and 401k and benefit corps through the ERISA, kind of ERISA legislation. But now they are all asking, because they have other stakeholders, like you said. If you take even a university endowment, you've got students now kind of rioting the schools and demanding the overseers of the endowment to be investing for the future as it relates to, and I have a good example with the environment. One college I was working with, they were getting so much pressure. The governing body over the endowment wasn't really, they're looking at the absolute return in traditional financial sense and not this other lens of impact. And they didn't start to actually kind of change their thinking until the next generation and the student body were approaching them and saying, wait a second, you're investing the endowment in all these things that are actually destroying and going against what we're trying to achieve with regard to, in this case, climate change and global warming. And that university came to me, and we start thinking about, okay, well, how can you resituate your portfolio? How can you allocate this capital in a way that supports also what the mission is for this university and what the student body is expecting to kind of leave a legacy around this capital? So that's a big yes, but that's also the reason that you're seeing more products being created that need more oversight, so there isn't the washing. And so I think that's what's getting a lot of attention right now, is how do you actually oversee all the product creationists so that all these governing bodies that have to conduct due diligence on each of these ideas is able to actually understand them, right? That they can actually point from, okay, my dollar did this, it started here, and this was the goal, and I made this kind of progress, or this is this is patient capital, right? This is like longer than 10-year runway kind of ideas.
Yeah, Karen, so you pick on 2 points there that I want to, the second one I'll come back to, but one of the key points you brought up is the demands of working with, the college endowment, and how the students came out and said, we demand more from the investments that you're making, and climate, of course, being front and center of ESG, and in sort of reflecting on some of the trends that we're seeing here, going to the why part of why impact investing and why this matters, right? Millennials are the largest consumer market today. And the older millennials are at their prime spending age, and their attitudes towards sustainability is just unmatched, right? Morgan Stanley reports that, at least in the US, and I think we're seeing this in Asia as well, that millennials tend to purchase from sustainable brands twice as much. And we're most likely, I think it's 3 times more likely, choose to work with a company that has sustainable practices. So that's one trend. The other one is, further to, I guess, what David Swenson and the Larry Finks of the world are talking about is, and this is the part of ESG that I want to unpack with you a little bit, is 18% of assets are now allocated to ESG. Assets under management are allocated to ESG globally, and this will climb to about 40% in the next 5 years. So, when people ask me why should I think about sustainability, and my simple answer is, well, if you can shut yourself off as a company, you're looking for capital, and if you can shut yourself off from 40% of capital, then fine, don't do anything sustainable. That's right. But it's still a conversation. So where are we in this ESG? And again, an area that I'm passionate about is gender seems to be left behind in the conversation on climate and all that. So can you talk to us a little bit of what you're seeing in the market from an ESG standpoint here?
Yeah, no, and that's exactly right. So Larry Fink has been a really part of the Business Roundtable. And so a group of CEO leaders led by Larry Fink have come out in that roundtable, and he publishes this in his annual letter, really calling on corporations to take some responsibility, to consider the role they play in stakeholder capitalism. And then that's leading to some traction around, how do we reimagine what capitalism should look like for everyone to participate more equally? One of the things to the statistic, the U.S. SIF, which is the United States Sustainable Investment Forum, that is headed by Lisa Wall, they do some fantastic data tracking and just the inflows. So to your point, how much is invested in a fund that identifies as ESG, right? And so they don't have to do all three of those things, the E, the S, and the G. They can just do one, and they would qualify for that. It grew four times larger in volume than from 2012 to 2020.
Wow.
So just to kind of show the proliferation of funds that are standing up and saying, hey, we are an ESG themed fund. What's really interesting is you unpack it based on really the call to action that Larry Fink and others have expressed in kind of corporate sustainability and the role that corporations play throughout their verticals, right? A company may not identify as an ESG company, but they certainly have they have CSR teams, corporate social responsibility teams, that are checking a lot of boxes that could qualify them to meet a lot of those sustainability criteria. And so there's that intersection happening. So that dynamic is happening across the S&P 500. There's an organization, I think hugely that polls the American people, to your point on millennials, and kind of what they think that the highest needs are and who might be responsible for satisfying those needs. And overwhelmingly all Americans, the poll came in on that, about 70% of the Americans that were polled said, yes, corporations have a responsibility to play here. They can help close the wealth gap. They can help close income gap. They can help improve diversity throughout leadership ranks. They hold the power, right? And so it's not just about figuring out what the next entitlement program should be in this country. I don't believe that's the answer. I think it's about how do we actually use the capital markets to benefit all. With more voices in that conversation, I think we'd be better in the future. You can only grow the entitlement pie so big, right? Because it has to be funded from something. But that's where you're seeing, and just a funny story, I was buying some new school shoes for my son, and the ones he picked out because they had a sign on them that said that these shoes were made, Adidas makes them, it's a certain line of Adidas, right, that says that this is made entirely from recycled ocean plastic. Right. So the next generation is very much aware of their role and the footprint, pun intended, that they want to leave. Right?
Yeah. Well, Karen, we could go on and on, but this is a short power hour, 30 minutes, and then we'll go on to Clubhouse very shortly to open it up. But let's get practical here. You advise your clients from the wealthiest family offices to the endowments and foundations to do the right thing, right? To invest their dollars and scale impact in a meaningful way. And today I was on a separate room on Clubhouse where there was a bit of a debate on, the fact is, unfortunately, for certain parts of impact, you can't activate that to get market returns. And then, another leader, I think he's from Full Cycle, said that eventually we'll get to a place where impact investing isn't even a thing because everything that we're investing in has to tie in with impact. So how do we do this? How do we design for impact practically? What are the billion-dollar moves here that we can take? I mean, we've got VCs. I see VCs. I see some senior leaders on the call here that are leading their charges in their different ways. But how can we design for impact and do that at scale?
Oh, I think well, first, I do agree with that. I think if you have to make investments that are not in ignorance of what the policy making is doing, right? So if you're looking at investment and all the policy wins are against you, it might not be successful by any metric, financial or otherwise. The big moves that you can make, and if you think about where especially in the venture capital world, where
Mhm.
where you see the business growth sector happening, and basically Latin women, Black women, those are the largest by head count new businesses forming in America. I'd get behind some of those ideas.
Right.
I would start to actually put money where you think the system needs changing. Those particular groups have not had, due to legislative headwinds and banking regulations we've had over the years, have not had access to capital in the ways that other individuals have, other white folks have had. And so I would get behind those ideas. Those are going to be big billion-dollar moves, and there will be success from that. And especially coming off of the unemployment numbers, specifically targeting women, because they were
Mhm.
the caregivers, teachers, hospitality workers. They covered most of the sectors that were battered last year. And so there's going to be a big sea change of power and where those women start to come back into the workforce. And so supporting companies that hire women.
Mhm.
So whether you're doing this from a consumer perspective or whether you're doing this as an investor in a company, look at who their client, their customers are, who their employee makeup, what they look like, what their boards look like. So really kind of put your money where your mouth is. If you actually believe that we all have the power to succeed, fund those ideas, right?
Right.
Like fund them just as you would have just as we would have funded a similar idea owned by someone that doesn't look like us. Right. So there's going to have to be a little bit of a leap of faith for some people, but I think that's where I'm very conscious of what companies I shop with and make purchases from, and what brands. Website I love is Know the Chain, and so I look at Know the Chain. You can have a great deal of influence in not supporting organizations that are doing the harm.
Right.
And those are easy consumer ways. And then the investor ways are actually to back some of these impact themes that are actually right behind the system change.
Great. So playing a role that in sort of pushing your influence as a consumer and as an investor, I guess from an LP and GP standpoint as well, I think, trying to move the needle here. And, I think that's what a lot of the folks on the call and that are watching are really trying to do. So with that, Karen, thank you so much. I think we really try to jam in as much as we can on impact where we are,
We did.
opening the kimono, running through a lot of, key trends here, from the rise of millennials to ESG and just how important that is in moving forward. So thanks so much, Karen, for running through all that. And now, this is the end of the first part of us